what avoidants secretly think about you during no contact. You know what's fascinating? When someone with avoidant tendencies pulls away, most people assume it means you've lost them. That silence feels like rejection. But here's the truth. Avoidants don't stop thinking about you during no contact. In fact, that's often the moment when their thoughts about you are the loudest. At first, their instinct is relief, finally some space. But human connection doesn't just disappear because someone creates distance. Over time, their mind drifts back to you. They remember the little things you brought into their world. The laughter, the energy, the way you made them feel seen without them having to perform. And here's the part they won't admit. The silence you've given them, it forces them to sit with themselves. It confronts them with questions like, did I push away someone valuable? Did I mistake closeness for suffocation? See, avoidants secretly admire your strength when you don't chase. They may never say it out loud, but they notice. And that's what creates a shift, not in their words, but in how they feel about you. So, if you're in no contact right now, remember this, the story isn't they don't care. The story is often they're learning how much you mattered in the space you left behind. When someone with avoidant tendencies first pulls away and you step into no contact, the very first thing that often happens in their mind is a wave of relief. It's almost like they exhale for the first time after holding their breath. For them, closeness can feel overwhelming, even threatening. So the absence of calls, texts, or pressure immediately feels like space. That space is what they've been craving. But here's the twist. It doesn't stay that way for long. That initial relief isn't the full story. It's only the first chapter. In those early days of silence, they tell themselves, this is what I needed. Finally, no demands. Finally, no expectations. They convince themselves that distance is freedom. They focus on their independence, on regaining control of their emotional environment. But human connection doesn't switch off just because someone says they need space. The mind has a funny way of wandering back, even when the heart tries to lock the door. As the hours and days move forward, that silence begins to feel different. At first, it's comforting. Then, little by little, it becomes noticeable. And when something is noticeable, it becomes thought-provoking. That's when reflection starts creeping in. The same person who once felt overwhelmed by your closeness starts asking themselves questions they didn't expect. They wonder what you're doing. They wonder if you're thinking about them. They wonder if the comfort they're feeling now might be temporary and whether they've traded intimacy for emptiness. The irony is, avoidants often think they want uninterrupted freedom, but freedom without connection starts to feel hollow. In that hollow space, their mind replays interactions they had with you. They remember the sound of your laughter. They remember how you supported them in ways they didn't even acknowledge at the time. They remember how effortless certain moments felt. And suddenly, the space that once felt like oxygen starts to feel like distance. The relief that filled their chest now competes with a subtle ache of something missing. This reflection isn't always conscious. Sometimes it comes in flashes, a song that reminds them of you, a quiet evening where their phone stays empty, a small moment where they notice the absence of your presence. At first, they dismiss it. I'm fine. I wanted this. But the brain is clever. It knows what it misses before the ego is willing to admit it, and that's where the shift begins. Relief transforms into reflection. They begin to realize that space doesn't erase the bond. It only highlights it, and while they may never admit this out loud, inside their mind, there's a growing awareness. You mattered more than they let themselves feel when you were close. That awareness is born not from your presence, but from your absence. And that's the quiet paradox. What started as relief eventually evolves into reflection, and reflection often leads them back to the truth they were trying to avoid in the first place. When the silence stretches on during no contact, something subtle happens in the mind of an avoidant. Memories begin to surface. They may have pushed you away, convinced themselves that they needed distance, but in the stillness, the brain has a way of filling the gaps with recollections of the past. At first, it can be as simple as a random image. Maybe the way you smiled when you were both joking around, or a phrase you used to say that stuck with them. Those small flashes begin to accumulate, and suddenly they're replaying the good moments they shared with you, often more vividly than when you were around. This happens because avoidants, despite their efforts to detach, are still wired like everyone else to connect. Emotional bonds don't vanish just because someone suppresses them. In fact, when they try not to feel, the mind compensates by revisiting memories, almost as if to remind them of what they're pushing away. And those memories aren't usually the difficult conversations or the points of conflict. They're the lighter, warmer moments, the ones that brought them comfort, laughter, and a sense of safety they might not have admitted they valued at the time. They might recall a night where you both laughed until your stomachs hurt, or how you always seemed to know what to say when they were stressed. They might think about how you brought a sense of ease to their life, whether through small acts of kindness or simply through your presence. These memories begin to stand out in sharp contrast to the silence they created. What once felt like space now feels like an empty room, and those remembered moments of joy highlight just how much color you added to their world. It's often in this replaying that avoidance feels something they rarely want to acknowledge longing. Not necessarily a longing to rush back into closeness, but a longing for the feeling of being understood, appreciated, or cared for without having to ask. It creeps in quietly, often disguised as nostalgia. They may scroll past a place you once visited together and suddenly remember how it felt to be there with you. They may hear a familiar song that instantly ties back to a memory involving you. Each trigger reinforces the reality that while they sought distance, they cannot escape the imprint you left. This process is not dramatic or obvious. It doesn't come in waves of regret or grand declarations, but in quiet moments of reflection they don't share with anyone. Outwardly, they may appear indifferent or detached. Inside, however, there is a film reel of good times playing on repeat. Those moments remind them that you weren't just another person in their life, you brought experiences and emotions they can't easily replicate. And the more they replay those memories, the harder it becomes to maintain the illusion that distance has given them everything they wanted. When no contact begins, something happens that avoidants rarely prepare for. They're left alone with themselves. At first, that might feel like a victory to them. Finally, they've secured the space they craved. But as the days go on, the silence becomes less about peace and more about confrontation. Without your presence, without your voice, without the dynamic of the relationship to distract them, they're faced with something unavoidable, their own patterns. And in that quiet, questions begin to surface, questions they often work very hard to avoid. They may ask themselves, why do I always feel the need to pull away when things get close? Or did I overact by creating this distance? These questions don't come in a neat, reflective way like someone journaling about personal growth. They appear in subtle and uncomfortable flashes, moments when they notice they're missing something, moments when they realize the silence isn't as comforting as they imagined, moments when they remember the effort you gave and recognize they didn't meet you halfway. The absence forces them to confront realities that are much easier to ignore when someone is still there, trying, giving, and chasing. It's human nature to notice what you had once it's no longer available, and avoidants are no exception. In fact, no contact amplifies this because it removes the possibility of reassurance. When you're not reaching out, they can't lean on the idea that you'll always be there, waiting. They're left to wrestle with the possibility that their actions, pushing you away, withdrawing, refusing vulnerability, might have cost them something meaningful. That realization doesn't necessarily lead them to instant change, but it does create a pressure inside. Avoidants are often skilled at compartmentalizing, at distracting themselves with work, hobbies, or surface-level connections. But those strategies eventually lose their grip when the memory of your presence lingers. In the quiet, they see the gap between the closeness they secretly crave and the behavior that keeps them from sustaining it. This tension is uncomfortable, and it exposes them to feelings of guilt, regret, or even fear. Fear that they sabotage something important. Fear that they may repeat this cycle again and again. Fear that intimacy is slipping away not because of others, but because of their own patterns. What makes this stage so powerful is that it's involuntary. They didn't choose to sit down and self-reflect. The silence you created through no contact did that for them. The absence of your effort is what holds up a mirror, and while they may not admit these thoughts to you or even to themselves clearly, the confrontation is happening beneath the surface. In those moments, they're not just thinking about you, they're thinking about who they are in relationships, what they've done, and whether pushing away love is really the protection they've convinced themselves it is. One of the most surprising things that happens during no contact is the quiet respect avoidants start to feel for you when you don't chase them. It may not look that way on the surface, because avoidants are rarely the type to openly admit admiration, especially when it challenges their sense of control. But underneath, they notice it. When they pull back and expect the other person to run after them, and instead you hold your ground, it sends a message far louder than words ever could. It tells them you value yourself, that you don't need their approval to feel complete, and that you are capable of walking away if the situation no longer serves you. For an avoidant, that is both unsettling and attractive. They are used to people bending over backwards to win them back, trying harder when they withdraw, chasing after their attention. When you refuse to play into that pattern, it disrupts their expectations. The silence you maintain becomes a statement of self-worth, and deep down, they admire it because it's something they don't always possess themselves. Avoidants often struggle with confidence in relationships. They fear losing independence, but they also fear not being enough. Watching you stand firm and resist chasing speaks to a kind of strength they secretly long for. There's also a shift in the power dynamic that they can't ignore. When someone consistently chases an avoidant, it gives the avoidant a sense of control. They get to decide how close or how far the relationship goes. But when no contact is established and you stick to it, that control is interrupted. Suddenly, they are the ones wondering. They are the ones questioning. They are the ones left with curiosity about whether you're still thinking of them or whether you've moved on. That reversal creates respect, because they realize you are not operating from a place of desperation, but from a place of choice. This kind of strength is magnetic, even if they resist acknowledging it. Human beings are drawn to confidence, to people who know their value and are not afraid to enforce boundaries. And while an avoidant may never come forward to praise you for it, the respect builds internally. They start to look at you differently, recognizing that you are not like the people who collapse under pressure or compromise their own worth just to keep someone else around. In their private thoughts, they may even compare your reaction to past experiences where people chased, begged, or pleaded, and the difference is striking. That unspoken admiration often lingers even if they remain silent. It might not lead them to immediately reach out or admit what they feel, but it influences the way they see you. Your ability to hold space for yourself, to resist chasing, and to show that you have a life independent of them makes you stand out. And though avoidants may fear closeness, they can't help but recognize the quiet power of someone who doesn't lose themselves when distance appears. When silence settles in and no contact stretches longer than they expected, avoidants begin to feel the weight of what's missing. At first, they might tell themselves that the quiet is a relief, that the space is exactly what they needed. But over time, that silence shifts in meaning. It stops being about freedom and starts becoming a mirror that reflects just how much you matter to them. What once felt like an escape begins to feel like a loss, and that realization has a way of catching them off guard. They notice the absence in small, almost invisible ways. The empty phone screen where your name used to pop up, the lack of someone checking in on them, the missing voice that once brought comfort. At first, they may try to brush it off, convincing themselves that they're fine without it. But the longer the silence goes on, the harder it is to ignore the truth your presence added something irreplaceable to their life. They might not have seen it clearly when you were around, because closeness made them uncomfortable, but the distance highlights it in sharp relief. It's often only when something is gone that people realize its true value, and avoidants are no different. In their quiet moments, they begin to reflect on the role you played, not just as a partner, but as someone who brought lightness, stability, or joy into their days. They may not label it as love or attachment right away, but they recognize the shift in how life feels without you in it. Even if they don't admit it to anyone, even if they try to drown it out with distractions, there's a growing awareness that something meaningful slipped through their hands. That awareness is uncomfortable, but it's also undeniable. What makes this stage powerful is that it's not triggered by anything you're doing. It's triggered by what you've stopped doing. The silence itself becomes the teacher. By not chasing, not explaining, and not filling the gap, you allow the void to speak louder than any words could. And avoidants feel it. They may not say, "I miss you," but the way their thoughts drift back to you, the way they compare others to you, or the way they replay certain moments in their head shows that your worth is becoming clearer to them. The realization of your value often shows up in subtle emotional shifts. Instead of just remembering the tension or discomfort they once felt in closeness, they begin to recall the laughter, the safety, and the ease you brought. Instead of focusing on how much they wanted distance, they start recognizing how much life feels emptier without your presence in it. That silence they once sought now magnifies your significance. And in that recognition, they come face to face with something they rarely admit. Losing you may have cost them far more than they realized at the time. So if you've been sitting in silence, wondering what's happening in the mind of an avoidant during no contact, remember this: the absence isn't empty. It's doing more than you think. What starts as relief for them often becomes reflection. The space they wanted ends up highlighting the very things they miss about you. And in that quiet, they are confronted not only with your worth, but with their own patterns. Your strength in holding boundaries, in not chasing, becomes something they deeply respect, even if they'll never put it into words. And perhaps most importantly, the silence itself teaches them the lesson they would never have learned if you had continued reaching out. You mattered, and they feel that truth more clearly now than ever. So the next time you're tempted to doubt yourself, to question whether they care, or to break the silence just to ease the discomfort, remember this: the space you're holding is powerful. It's not just protecting your dignity, it's reminding them of your value in the only way that truly sinks in, by letting them feel your absence. Thank you for giving me your time and attention today. I hope this message has not only given you insight into avoidant behavior, but also reminded you of your own strength and worth. Take care of yourself, honor your boundaries, and trust that the silence you hold is speaking louder than you realize. Thank you and goodbye.